Hello and welcome to another episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Blundell and today we've created an episode with a little bit of a difference. So over the last 12 months I've been asking our podcast guests what they think about the use of silence in therapy. So this is a topic that often comes up with students when they're at the early stages of their training, and sometimes I find students find it difficult to sit with silence. They have questions about the appropriateness or length of silences in their therapeutic work. So I thought it might be interesting to explore this with our podcast guests. And we've got a selection of those questions and answers in this episode today. So it's been an interesting episode to work on as I've come back to think about and edit these clips together. It's made me reflect on some of my own therapeutic work with clients and my own comfortableness and challenges with silences. If you'd like to join this conversation, then you can tag us on social media or use our hashtag. And as always, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. I hope you enjoy this episode. So for this first clip, it's a throwback to an interview I completed with Sam Hope. Sam is an experienced trainer who has been working with EDI anti-oppressive practice for over a decade. They mainly work in the third sector, in education and offering CPD as a therapist, as well as being a visiting lecturer on several therapist training programmes in the UK. Sam's background is an accredited person centred therapist with specialisms in trauma, anti-oppressive practice and working with diversity. Sam's book, Person Centred Counselling for Trans and Gender Diverse People, is available from Jessica Kingsley Publishers. You can hear a full interview with Sam where they talk about their life and work in our podcast episode from January. But here's Sam reflecting on their experiences of silence in therapy.
I feel like I talk about this a lot with my supervisees, and I was interested, and I can't remember who it was, somebody or other has done some research about how clients really don't like silence as much as therapists think they do, which I think is very interesting research, but I feel like it misses something, and I feel like this whole conversation about silence misses something because, and I don't know whether this is your experience, but it's certainly mine, that there are different qualities of silence with different clients. And for me, there's yes, I have to learn to be comfortable with silence, but I also have to learn to read my discomfort. Am I still in connection with my client in this silence? Because if I'm not in connection with my client in this silence, then the silence is totally useless and possibly damaging. Am I holding my client still? Is my client floundering in the silence? Do they need something from me? Am I leaving the silence for them, or am I leaving the silence because somebody during my counselling training said I have to learn to be comfortable with silence, and I interjected that so hard that I just leave a silence no matter what, and I don't read the room. So for me, there is something really important about presence and connection and knowing if I'm with my client in that silence and having a sense of what's going on for that client. It's a bit like, when they say to you when you're training, if you're asking a client how do they feel, then your empathy is failing. It's not enough to just have some kind of off-the-shelf idea of silence good. You have to know what this silence means and what is going on for that client in that silence. So yeah, for me, it's an it depends question, really.
I love that. When you were talking, I was thinking about the idea of like the texture of a silence, because if you say silence, it can create this image, this blank space, but actually there is something going on within that, both within me as the therapist and the client, and between us as well. And suppose actually trying to get to a point where you understand what is going on, so you know how to use or not use silences, or how to be or not be in silences is, I think, kind of what you were trying to say there.
Absolutely. And, I have some clients who, there is a lot of silence with them. And then I have other clients, and particularly I work with a lot of people with ADHD, and and often silence means their mind has, and this happens to me as a client too. The mind's just sort of gone off somewhere, and if I leave them, then we'll flounder. And knowing the difference is really important.
That was Sam describing their thoughts on silence in therapy. It's interesting, as I've been editing this podcast, I use some kind of software that also helps me with the process. It's new to this series of the Therapist Connect podcast episodes, and one of the features on it is that every time I go to edit something, it asks me, do I want to remove the long silences automatically from the recorded interviews? So it automatically takes them out of people's speech. And I usually just click yes and accept those silences be taken out to help with the flow of the podcast. And sometimes we're trying to make it short and punchy so that people can listen to it quickly wherever they are. But as I've been editing this episode, I've just questioned a little bit of why that I feel the need to do that. And so I've left some of those longer silences in, and particularly in this next clip where Sara talks about her relationship with silence. From your experience as a grief counsellor, could you tell us your experience and your understanding of the therapeutic use of silence in therapy sessions?
What I think is at the heart of grief counselling, and I'm sure lots of other kinds of counselling as well, is around people having to struggle to find their own meaning and make sense of what is the purpose and point of me and where am I in this new landscape that I find myself living in. And I think that is probably core to what might be going on for lots of bereaved people, for example. And if you then think about how might you therapeutically start to create a space for that, you're not going to fill it with words. And I'm quite chatty. I would say it's probably on my list of things to constantly keep an eye on, because I start chatting away and making jokes and all that kind of stuff. So really trying to bring myself down all the time to hold a silence, so that meaning can emerge, because it's not my meaning for sure, it's the other person's meaning that needs to emerge. And the moment you say anything, I've learned that even an injudicious at the wrong time can shape and take a client somewhere, that isn't perhaps where they need to go. So really working hard on just holding the space. I'm not uncomfortable with silence. I just have a naturally chatty nature, I think, which I just need to be aware of. And I guess all therapists need to know who they are in the room and how they are. So I think silence is, it is rich with possibilities. And it's through the silence, and silence allows you to feel things in a way that is different. And I think, interestingly enough, being silent with someone else whilst they feel it, and possibly you feel some of it as well, is an extraordinary transformative potential in that. So I really believe in the transformative possibilities of silence. And I mentioned earlier that I like a bit of poetry, and I wanted to share a really short poem, but just offer it now, if I might, and then just hold a second or two of silence at the end, so that we can just see what that feels like. Is that all right?
That would be lovely. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the poem is by someone called Kate Fox, and it's really very short. And I will say one sentence about what I think it is, rather than too much, because I think it's about the silence afterwards. But I think this is about the courage of the bereaved. That's all I'm going to say. So the poem is called Portrait. Something brave in reading a person's light to make a still of their image, which captures them in flight. Something brave in reading a person's light to make a still of their image, which captures them in flight. And that courage to actually look at what you're feeling and look at who's died and look at what was really going on. There certainly is something brave in that. And I think that emerges, you can hear in my voice, I find it very moving, through the silence that you can hold inside yourself just to feel those words. So that, I thought I wanted to demonstrate to you what silence means, rather than talk too much about it.
Thank you, Sarah. I felt really moved hearing that, and in the silence as well.
What is that courage?
Yeah.
God, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Absolutely extraordinary.
And going back to what you were saying earlier about the almost like the creative possibilities of the silent, because so much can potentially happen in that moment, and although it might be unspoken, it's still felt or thought. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. That felt really connecting between us as well. I hope that communicates to other people.
If you want to hear more from Sarah, you'd need to go back to the episode we recorded, which was released in April 2023. Sarah is a Senior Accredited Counsellor registered with the BACP. She is a qualified Counselling Supervisor and Trainer. She's also headed up bereavement services in the voluntary sector for many years before setting up her bereavement counselling practice. Then our next clip is taken from my interview with Diane Sotomay, which was released in September 2023. Diane is the best-selling author of Check Your Thoughts, Your Life Depends on It, How Your Thoughts Shape Your Everyday Life and Who You Become. She is also a UKCP registered psychotherapist, clinical supervisor and trainer. Diane is a visiting tutor at the TA East Institute for Psychotherapy and Counselling and currently resides in the tranquil countryside of Suffolk. In this clip, Diane reflects on what the potential benefits of silences are for clients.
I do feel like silence is necessary because it can be a way of drilling the work with your client a little bit deeper, in the sense of if you were to ask a question and sometimes just leave that question, a powerful question, with a client, it can allow them to take a back step, to stop and reflect and actually come up with something that might have been bubbling that they hadn't quite thought about. But because of that silence, it creates the space for that to emerge. So, and I think it can also work just as well for the therapist because it enables one to stop and think, okay, where am I? What's going on? What is needed right now? So I think silence is really useful for both the client and the therapist, but I think it can deepen the work for both.
Absolutely. It's almost like a pause in the interaction, but space to think for both people, the client and the therapist.
Yes.
And possibly new insights come from that, or
that's it.
Or just new feelings or reflections as you think about the question or or what's happening in that silence. Yeah.
Yes, and new shifts.
Yeah, new shift and changes. Yeah. Whilst it's important to talk about the benefits of silences within our therapeutic work, I think it's also important that we're honest about the difficulties and the challenges that can come up. In this next clip, Maxine talks about the challenges that she faced when thinking about and using therapeutic silence.
As I was saying that I wasn't going to think about this question too much because I know that I could have. So, I mean, I remember in training, you know, we did do a lot of work around the use of silence in the therapeutic space. And I'm going to put my hands up and be really honest and say that as a new accredited psychotherapist, I found it really difficult. I think, you know, as well as that, because it was during the pandemic, and I think online it's even more uncomfortable than it is face to face. But I think the thing about the use of silence is that not only does it give the client a chance to think, it also gives the counsellor a chance to think, and that's not always a good thing. Because as a new counsellor, for me, rightly or wrongly, that space was filled with what do I need to do? What can I do? And a little bit of panic. And it took a while and a bit of supervision and a bit of introspection to settle myself with that and to be okay with that. And I think that's probably a process that a lot of people go through.
Maxine, I'm so happy that you said that, because teaching students all the time and seeing the difficulty with silence, it's kind of, I suppose, one of the reasons why I was interested in asking different therapists' opinions on this was because how difficult silences I know can be for some people. And so I think people listening to this who are just coming, you know, in training or just kind of becoming qualified and thinking, oh my goodness, like, you know, having difficulties with it, to hear that other therapists have gone through that process, I think is really important.
And it is a process. It is a process. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And if you want to hear more from Maxine, you can check out our episode from October 2023, where I interview her about her life and work. Maxine has been a counsellor and psychotherapist for over 11 years, with over 4 years' experience in private practice. She has been accredited with the Irish Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists since 2019. And up until the end of 2023, Maxine was also one of the Therapist Connect volunteers who was running our Twitter account on a Mondays. And Maxine, we still miss you on the account, so we wish you well, whatever you're doing now. In our next clip, we hear from Dr. Fraser Smith, who is a counselling psychologist and clinical director for Psychology Scotland. There was a Therapist Connect podcast episode released interviewing him in May 2023. So you can go back and check that out if you want to hear more from him. Fraser is a chartered psychologist, registered with the HCPC and BPS, with years of experience and training working within therapy. He specialises in working with men's mental health and has worked in therapy with men, researched the field and become a recognised speaker within this area for a number of years. Can you tell us your experience and your understanding of the therapeutic use of silence in your therapeutic sessions?
Yeah, when that question comes up, the first feeling I have is dread. And I think that, you know, for me, and I'll explain what that is because when I was training, and I think again when studying, that the idea of silence in a therapeutic relationship meant you were doing something wrong. You know, when a client sits and stares at you, waiting for you to say the next thing, or when you don't know what to say, that often kind of, it sparks that kind of that initial stages of training dread for me. But as my experience has built, you know, I've understood the value in silence a lot more. For me, the importance of it really kind of stems from not, how to best word this, not saving my clients as such, or allowing clients to feel that they need to be saved. And I think that is something I've wrestled with a lot, and still get wrong, and still grapple with this idea that it's not okay to be silent in that therapeutic space because I need to be saving, and I need to be doing the work, and I need to be pulling my clients through to change. And actually the silence can really reveal, I think, what's most important to that client, and also the fact that I'm a huge believer in the individual and the power of autonomy, and that individual can overcome their difficulties. And I think that's explored in silence often. I think there's also something like I do a lot of, and this is just from me, I do a lot of work in men's mental health. And what I've come to know, with the men I see in therapy is that silence is something that they find very uncomfortable. Maybe that's the demographic, maybe that's the geography of the west of Scotland here. But there's something about discomfort in that silence, and not having something to say, and not saying something, and being in connection and relationship with somebody that can feel uncomfortable for some people in general, but I also experience it particularly with men at times. And I've tried to utilize silence much more rather than trying to save these people and again pull them through to change. How can I sit with that silence and explore the discomfort of it as well, both in me and in my client? And I've understood the value. It's come from a place of real dread at first and fear that I would have nothing to say and my clients would have nothing to say, to one of recognizing real value and therapeutic growth in it. So it's kind of it's grown in its importance for me over my career, so to speak.
I think that's really interesting, and it reminds me now of kind of being a lecturer sitting in personal development groups, and kind of the silence comes along, and students kind of sat there going, "Oh God, what is this? Like, we're not doing anything. It's so horrendously awful." And so for me, there's like that dual thing of like, yes, being able to sit comfortably in silence,
yes.
But then also like silences people can suffer like in silence,
absolutely,
you know, and they can be quite cruel. So it's a real difficult balance, I think.
It really is. It's it's a great point. The idea of sitting and staring at someone, I think that's a wonderful point, actually. It's a very fine balance, because the idea of sitting and staring at someone for a therapeutic hour, or when somebody is being, viscerally tortured in that silence, that's, I think, something very much to avoid. But I also think it's within context. When we're exploring, for example, maybe if we're utilizing a trauma model and we're exploring stability, or we're exploring an element of processing of certain traumas, and certain things are said or certain things are unpacked and explored, I think silence is more important than ever to allow a space for healing, particularly within trauma work, where it's not about just saying the next thing and getting through the next stage of processing, or getting through to that reintegration stage, or establishing more stability. Actually, the silence is a healing place for when certain things of processing are done and spoken about. So yeah, I think you make a very good point. It's not a case of just sitting and torturing people, but it's using silence in the right way at the right time, in my eyes, anyway.
I had a similar conversation with William Pullen where we discussed, actually, is silences always beneficial for the client, or could there be times when actually we really need to think about the use of silences? I interviewed William in July 2023, so you can go back and listen to that episode if you're interested. William is a qualified psychotherapist registered with BACP. He offers short and long-term psychotherapy to adults and young people on an individual basis in West London. He has a book and an app that explores the relationship between running and therapy. He also offers running therapy, so he talks about silences within that context.
Silence is the great terror, isn't it? I mean, you're asking me what I think of it as the therapist rather than for the client, I assume. For myself, at the risk of saving my clients, I suppose is the term we'd use, I try to minimize it. And certainly until I'm absolutely sure that we're comfortable, I'm certainly not overdoing it, trying to overdo it either, but I'm not employing it. And if it gets to a point where I can tell it's uncomfortable for the client, and we're not making any progress with that the discomfort isn't informative. It doesn't tell me something which I can then use usefully. If it's just there, then I'm going to address it. So there's your answer.
I think that's really interesting. And I like that idea of kind of minimizing it to start with and then kind of gradually kind of seeing how it fits. I mean, I know some therapists who would use it like consistently to start off with and use that as a therapeutic tool. So, but I think I'd lean more towards your approach, I think, than I wondered whether it made any difference being outside with clients, and also the fact that, there's potentially people around and stuff like that. So there might be moments of silence in the running therapy. Potentially there might be different from in a therapeutic space or in a room.
Yeah, definitely. Whenever we're passing some people, whether running or walking, I'm very conscious of whatever those people might hear. So I'll just stop talking. But it's very brief. My client understands from the first time it happens that I pick up very quickly right afterwards. So that's not the thing. But I think what you're talking about there is how silence different when moving on the outside. It's a lot easier as the answer, because this is a beautiful thing about nature. And I say nature because I work in the parks, but it holds you, doesn't it? There's so much to see and smell and feel. And you're involved in something. The therapeutic moment is much less terrifying, because as you amble your way through this park or you lie down, somehow you're active in your therapy in a way that just sitting there in somebody else's therapy room feels a lot less active.
I mean, that really struck me as you were talking. I was thinking about that. Actually sat across from somebody having a silence can feel very, very different. I imagine then, as you say, being active and running or walking or whatever, there's lots of things going on. So although you might be silent, there is still lots of things going on, either in the environment or between you as client and therapist. So yeah, that's really interesting. So we're coming into our final couple of clips now. And this next one is from Maria Sokopud. Maria is an experienced GP who specialises in gastroenterology and is a transactional analysis psychotherapist. Maria is a therapist working in Ukraine, and so our conversations were framed obviously by the ongoing conflict where she lives and works. If you missed Maria's episode, I do encourage you to go back and listen to that, which was released in March 2023.
I guess a couple of years ago, I would have said, what, silence? But right now, I think I really appreciate it in work. I would formulate it this way. We are bombarded by noises, by news, by information, by media, by our phones beeping, whatever. When you have this space with a client and you can actually shut up and give them the room, the arena, where they can finally step outside, not be judges, be themselves in their purest form. It's amazing what it does. It gives that room to grow that some clients never had that. Growing up in big families and big communities. I mean, here we have quite traditional families, a lot of kids, things like this. People didn't have that space. And when they finally get it, it might be, I mean, some of them are shocked. Some of them are afraid of silence. They're not used to it. But when you experience it in a safe way, that silence doesn't mean something horrible is going to happen. That's the beauty of it. I guess that's why I kind of appreciate it in work. When it starts happening more and more and more, sometimes you reach the point where you can keep quiet most of the session. That happens too, especially right now. I mean, we have way too much intrusive stimuli, starting with bomb alerts. Those suck. So, yeah.
It was interesting when I sent you that question, and I was thinking, so I thought about obviously the therapeutic use of silence, but then it made me think about, because I knew some of the things we were going to talk about, made me think about silence in a more general terms as well, in terms of how important it can be, but then also potentially how damaging it can be when people are silent about particular topics and you know, not talking about the difficulties or the things that are happening in Ukraine at the moment. Not necessarily in therapy necessarily, but I was just thinking in the broader kind of
in a broader sense,
issues of silence. Yeah,
I guess there's a lot of pressure right now, what to talk about, what not to talk about. And sometimes you have to process it for quite a while to define what you actually want to say. Because, I mean, obviously I can go into a temper tantrum and be raging and be angry, etc., etc. Will it help? I don't think so. So, yeah, I did take a break for a while, for quite a few days when I was processing the beginning of war. I just kept shut. I had to figure it out for myself.
And that's important in silence as well, I suppose, isn't it? For having that contemplation and reflection, not necessarily reacting, but having time to kind of think about what does this mean to me and how am I going to make sense of this?
I remember the morning on the 24th of February. As I mentioned, I grew up in Istanbul and we did have bombing in the terrorist attacks. So I knew what that sounds like. That moment, talking about silence, I was standing in front of my window looking at missiles exploding and the red hue and flames, etc. And I was standing there kind of like, oh, damn it. For almost like 20, 30 minutes, I was shut down. Then I started calling people, etc., etc. But that moment, you know, when you're standing, looking, observing your reality crashing down, silence, yeah, that was silence. Yeah.
For this last clip is Rachel Cook, who we featured in last month's episode when we discussed the book Therapists Challenging Racism and Oppression, the Unheard Voices, for which she is an editor and also one of the book chapter authors. Whilst Rachel wasn't asked about the use of therapeutic silence in her discussion of the book, the topic of silence within the profession came up, and I thought this was a poignant clip to end on, so I asked Rachel for her permission to include this at the end of the episode. This clip was originally recorded in January 2024.
I guess the final just note that I wanted to share was about, it goes back to the political aspect of this. Something that I've really noticed is the reticence of a lot of practitioners, and understandably for many different reasons. For some people it's frightening in private practice, for some people it's frightening working for the NHS or different organisations, but around speaking out against injustice. And I've seen that particularly with the kind of therapist silence around Palestine over the last few months, that it feels as though it's now becoming more accepted to call what's happening a genocide. And also it's been really quite striking how little I've seen practitioners. Now, maybe there's lots of private discussions going on, but publicly there's been very little so far. And I'm guessing that a lot of that is out of fear. But I think we're only beginning to find the language after 3 months of what's been happening there to be able to say that critiquing a government's choices is not the same as casting discrimination on a whole people or the people who live in that place. And that this is something that I really hope that we are going to be talking more about, because the silence has been pretty deafening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as I have recording and editing it. If you have enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform, and I'll be back next month interviewing another therapist about their life and work in the therapy community.